what? Holy. And anything that was unholy was to be taken where? Outside the camp. If it was unclean, it goes outside the camp. They are to rebuild the walls because God is letting them know you are a distinct people from all the nations around you. Rebuild the walls so that you'll remember what's in the holy city is to be holy because you're holy. All right, well, now we get to the book of Esther. Remember, when does Esther take place? From 483 BC to 473 BC. So Esther is happening between the first wave that Zerubbabel takes to Jerusalem and the second wave that Ezra takes to Jerusalem. You with me? That's kind of that timeline. You'll see some of that information in there as well. So that's kind of the time frame we're looking at here. Some interesting facts. The book of Esther is named after the orphan Esther, who became queen of Persia. Hadassah is the Hebrew name of Esther, and it means myrtle, which is a symbol of peace. Myrtle is a good name. That was my grandmother's name. Myrtle May. All right, Esther was an orphan who was raised by her cousin Mordecai. He basically raised her as her father. King Ahasuerus is the Hebrew transliteration of the king's Persian name, Xerxes. All right, so you'll see sometimes you'll see Artaxerxes referenced, Xerxes referenced. That's just the Greek name for King Ahasuerus. All right, in the Hebrew Bible, Esther is located in the latter section of the Old Testament, directly behind Lamentations. Where is it at right now in our Bibles? Behind Nehemiah, correct? All right. Matthew Henry in his commentary, it's not on your handout, but he says this: though the name of God be not in it, the finger of God is directing many minute events for the bringing about of his people's deliverance. Why do I say that? God is not mentioned in the book of Esther. Did you know that? The title, the name God, is not in the book. But we see God's fingerprints all over the book, don't we? We see his providential hand working throughout Esther to accomplish his providential plan. Now, who's the author? The human author is unknown. There's been many suggestions of Ezra, Nehemiah, or even Mordecai. The human author had to have a great knowledge of the Hebrew calendar because the Hebrew calendar is mentioned quite a bit in the book, but also of the Persian calendar and their customs and their laws because it's mentioned throughout the book. But ultimately, we know who is the ultimate author, the Holy Spirit. All right. Date, again, of the events, 483 to 473 BC, so it's been a few moons ago. All right. I think I got on your handout some significant dates. That's, again, just for your reminder there so that you'll have that. We've talked about the first and second and third wave, that this is happening between that first and second wave. The date, so that was the date that the events happened, but we need to look at the date that the book was actually composed, and we seem to think, late 5th century is when it was composed. Who was the original audience? Some of the Jews who were in captivity and some of the others that had been released. All right, now just background and purpose, just remember this. If we go all the way back to 2 Samuel, especially 1st, 2nd Kings, 1st, 2nd Chronicles, Israel had sinned against God. You remember that? All right, the northern kingdom fell first in 722 BC because they had rebelled against God, and God used Assyria to punish them. Some of them were taken captive. Well, the southern kingdom, Judah, would last a little bit longer, and in 586 BC, God would use the kingdom of Babylon and King Nebuchadnezzar, and he would go in and he would destroy Jerusalem, and he would haul off the majority of those Jews into captivity into Babylon. And there they would spend 70 years in the Babylonian captivity. We understand that through Daniel and other prophets where we see that. All right. So that's kind of the background, that there's Israel's disobeyed God. Didn't God promise back in Deuteronomy that if they disobeyed his laws, he would punish them? Yes. So that's they were the ones that got themselves in this predicament. But I have on your handout, why is a conflict from Exodus playing a part in Esther some 1,000 years later? Does anybody know? Without looking at your handout, without cheating. Let me ask you this. Did you know that the book of Esther is connected to Exodus? Well, it is. Obviously, it's in the grand redemptive story of the Bible, but did you know there's a connection to it? Anybody? No, when you study the book of Esther, you see it's so connected. So I asked that question, why is a conflict all the way from Exodus playing out in Esther? Well, if we were to turn to Exodus, and you don't have to, I'll turn for us. Exodus 17, real quickly, I'll read it. Exodus 17, verse 16. Let me back up to verse 15. And Moses built an altar and called the name of it, "The Lord is my banner." Now, we got to keep in mind, Israel has come right out of the Exodus. They've come right out of Egypt in the Exodus, and they run into the Amalekites. And the Amalekites do what? They go to battle against Israel. And God delivers them. He defeats the Amalekites, doesn't he? Well, he goes on to say in verse 16 here, saying, "A hand upon the throne of the Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation." Now, we're going to make the connection here in just a moment. So you got the kind of the background, right? The Amalekites date all the way back to the Exodus, and they stood in Israel's way, and Israel had to fight them when the Lord defeated them. All right, so the Amalekites, they attacked Israel after the Exodus. The Amalekites are descendants of Amalek, who is the son of who? Esau. I mean, it even goes back into Genesis, doesn't it? Now, the Lord commanded Israel in Deuteronomy 25, 17 through 19. I won't read those. You can go back and look at those later. But he commanded Israel to blot out the memory of Amalek, the Amalekites in Deuteronomy, because of the way they treated God's people. Israel disobeyed. They did not wipe them out, did they? Not completely. Well, since they did not wipe them out completely, when would they run into them again? 1 Samuel. Saul was commanded to destroy the Amalekites. Do you remember that? But he did not in 1 Samuel 15. God said, "Go destroy every one of them and do not take of the plunder." Don't even take of their livestock. And you remember that? So Israel goes in, they destroy some of them, they take some of them captive, they take some of the animals, some of the livestock. A few days later, Samuel shows up and he's like, "What is this I hear? There's bleeding from the animals in my ear." And Saul's like, oh, we took some of the best livestock because we were going to offer it for sacrifices unto God. He's worthy of that, isn't he? And Samuel's like, "Oh no, you fully disobeyed God. And because you, Saul, have disobeyed God, the kingdom is being ripped from your hands. And it's being given to another. And that other is who? David. It's going to be King David. Well, what does Samuel do in 1 Samuel 15 there? What does he do to the king of the Amalekites, King Agag? What does he do? Takes his sword, he cuts him into pieces, kills him. Remember that? Well, that's kind of the history there. And Israel would fight with the Amalekites from Exodus all the way through 1 Chronicles, on and off, because they disobeyed God and did not blot out their memory from the land, from the earth. So the happenings in Esther would occur some 550 years after King Agag was cut into pieces by Samuel. So you with me so far? Now, for those who love history, you're probably liking this. For those who hate history, just hold tight just a little bit longer with me, would you? All right. What does all this have to do with Esther? I know you're asking. Maybe you've already peeked. Maybe you've already read ahead and you already know. But for those who don't, here it is. Mordecai is a Jew, isn't he? From the tribe of Benjamin. He's a Benjamite from the clan or the family of Kish, who is the father of Saul. Esther chapter 2, verse 5 testifies to that. Haman, you know Haman in the book of Esther? He is a descendant of who? King Agag, the Amalekite king whom Saul and Israel fought against and who Samuel cut into pieces. Could that be why Mordecai refused to bow before a Amalekite and Haman? Could it be why Haman hated Mordecai and all the Jews? There was this family feud going on. Does that ever happen in the earth? I think that's part of the reason why Mordecai refused to bow ever to Haman. And I think that's why Haman hated Mordecai and the Jews so bad, because just 550 years later, his descendant was cut into pieces by some Jew. You with me? Do you see how the book of Esther touches Exodus? Do you see how all that informs kind of what's going on, the plot, the storyline, if you will, in the book of Esther? All right, so we see that there. Esther and Exodus can be compared because the Jews are trying to be eradicated by Egypt in the book of Exodus and Haman in the book of Esther. In both books, God protects his people and punishes their enemies. All right, what do we get from the book of Esther here? I say we, the Jews, they got the Feast of Purim. And this is a celebration of Israel's deliverance in their 12th month, which is our February-March time frame, and it would come from Esther chapter 9 and Esther chapter 10. Purim comes from the word pur in chapter 3, verse 7, and it means to cast lots. Now, when we get to that point, we won't read the whole book of Esther tonight. We're just going to hit kind of the highlights, but you'll see that Haman and his friends cast lots over and over in chapter 3, correct? Do you remember that? Pur, they were casting lots. And that's where the Feast of Purim comes in, that Israel celebrates every year. All right, some Jewish celebrations. The Jewish New Year begins in the spring with Passover. And of course, we know what Passover it is to celebrate Israel's deliverance from Egypt, from bondage. They also celebrate the Day of Atonement, which is Yom Kippur, in the fall. And they celebrate the Feast of Purim in February-March time frame to celebrate what has happened with God delivering his people from the hands of Haman. All right, so real quick, the purpose of the book of Esther, again, to remind Israel that they can trust God. Remember, some of them are still in captivity. Some of them have come out of captivity. And do you think they're ever wondering, has God forsaken us? Has God abandoned us? Has God left us? What was so wonderful and magnificent, the city of Jerusalem, the temple, the walls, has been brought down to something so meager in a sense. Maybe they're wondering. So the author here is reminding Israel, you can trust God. To remind them that God purposefully saves his people. And it's to establish the Feast of Purim here, so that they would do this annually to remember what God has done. Do we ever need to do things like that? I'm not saying legalistically do things, but do we ever need to remind ourselves of what God's done for us? We do, don't we? Yeah, how often? Every day. Every day. I like to say every day I need to get up while I'm brushing my teeth or looking in the mirror and rehearse the gospel. Because I need to remind myself every day of how wretched I am and how wonderful he is. Because if I don't, I want to remind myself how wonderful I am, and I'm not that wonderful, I promise. You already know that, though. I'm a wretched sinner in need of God's grace. I need to rehearse the gospel over and over. And these feasts were put in place to remind Israel that. So real quick, some themes that we'll see in Esther. God's sovereignty. There are no coincidences in life. There are no, it just happened. Have you ever thought about that? Well, that just happened. I met that person. I was 5 minutes late leaving the house, and when I got down the road, there was this huge accident. We say accident, but have you ever had things like that happen in your life? Who's orchestrated all that? Did it just happen? No. God's sovereign. He's in control of all things. We'll see God's sovereignty. We'll see man's obedience to God. Esther and Mordecai, they obey. We'll see the preservation of God's people and God's promise to David. Remember, think through all of this. When we went through 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, 1st, 2nd Chronicles, God promised David back in 2 Samuel that he would have a son who would sit on the throne for how long? Do we got to go back to 2 Samuel and start again? No. Forever. David, you will have a son that will sit on the throne forever. Now, who is that a reference to? Jesus. Now we understand that the next son to sit on the throne was Solomon, but we also understand that after Solomon dies, the United Kingdom is split into two kingdoms, right? A northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. Well, the northern kingdom is pretty much taken away and the southern kingdom remains for a little while. But even those kings in the southern kingdoms are what? They're preserved. Do you remember that? God continues to preserve those. And God is continuing to preserve that line even in the book of Esther. Because as we'll see, Haman put a edict out, a law out that the king signed that would do what to all of the Jews? Exterminate them, eradicate them completely. But God's like, oh no. I promised David that he would have a son. And that son will sit on the throne. And his name is Jesus Christ. All right. So central verses, we'll hit some of this. Let's look at the structure. We're going to break it down into three pieces. You got chapters 1 through 2. First, we see that God replaces Vashti with Queen Esther. So what you got the story. We're kind of going to walk through the story and the plot line here tonight real quickly. We come on the scene. You got the king Xerxes here. He's there. He throws a banquet. If you've read the book of Esther, he's having a great time. Just things are going wonderful. And he says, you know what? Go tell the queen to come up. Go tell him to come over. And what does the queen say? Nope. I'm not, for whatever reason, I'm not going over there. Does that embarrass the king? Yes. Is the king happy about it? No. So the king gets with his counselors, and his counselors are like, Chapter 1, King, if you don't do something about this, all the women in the land are going to start doing the same thing to their husbands, and there's going to be a revolt. Feminism started way back then, okay? So feminism is not anything new. Now, I'm not picking on females, I promise. But you see, right, what his counselors tell him. So what does the king do? The king just kind of, we can use the word divorce. He divorces the queen. He sends her away. He's like, if you won't come and submit to me, you're gone. Did that just happen? Now, what is God doing? Making the way for chapter 2, Queen Esther. So we get in the beginning of chapter 2, the Queen Vashti sent away. The counselors are like, look, we're going to go find the beautiful ladies in the province, in your empire. We'll bring them before you. And king, you'll get to select the next queen. Well, Queen Esther, not at this point, but Esther finds great favor, correct, in the king's eyes. Look at chapter 2. Look at verse 5. Now, there was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives, carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, when Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. He was bringing up Hadashus, that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. And when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. Now, I go over to verse 15 now of chapter 2. When the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his own daughter to go into the king, she asked for nothing except what Hegai, the king's eunuch, who had charge of the women, advised. Now Esther was winning favor in the eyes of all who saw her. And when Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 12th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign, the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Do you see what's happening? See how God has paved the way here for Esther to be moved in place? Sounds like a great story, doesn't it? Hallmark would love it, right? They'd put their little spin on it, I'm sure. Sounds like a great story. Well, that's the first portion. God moves out one queen and moves in his servant. All right, then we get to the second part of the structure here of the book of Esther, and it goes from chapter 2, verse 19, all the way through chapter 7. And what do we see? At the end of chapter 2, verses 19 through 23, Mordecai is sitting at the gate, and he hears about this plot to kill the king. Well, apparently this king, he would be assassinated some years later, so apparently a lot of people didn't like him because he had some assassination attempts on his life. Well, Mordecai hears that, he goes and he reports it, doesn't he? He reports it to Esther. Esther does what? She reports it back. It's researched. They look into it and discover it's a credible threat. They take care of the problem. The king is safe. That's chapter 2. All right. Now, what do we get to when we get to chapter 3, verse 1? This guy named Haman, who was a descendant of who? King Agag, the Amalekite, right? He is promoted by the king in chapter 3, verse 1. But then you get to chapter 3, verse 2, as Haman is walking by, and the king tells everybody they need to do what to Haman? Bow down, give him homage. Mordecai does what? I'm not going to bow before him. Well, what does that do to Haman? Makes him mad. Makes him mad. So that reignites that feud that's been going on. Well, we get to chapter 3, verses 3 through 15. Haman is furious with Mordecai, and he plots against Mordecai and the Jews. In chapter 3, we could see, I won't read the verses, but all the way through the whole chapter, Haman's basically putting this plot together, getting the king to sign off on this decree, this edict, to do what to the Jews? To exterminate them, to wipe them out. All right, so that's basically chapter 3 there. Then we get to chapter 4, and Mordecai learns of another plot. He's always in the right place at the right time. Has that ever happened to anybody? What's God doing? What's God doing? He puts his people exactly where he wants them. Has God ever placed you exactly where he's wanted you? Do you know the local church is made up of people that God has placed at the exact place at the exact time? Do you realize that about this church? That everybody in this church God has placed here. We could say it in the words of Esther, for such a time as this. That every one of you are here for a reason. That God's, whether you've been here for 60-something years, your whole life, or for 6 months, all of us are here for a reason. And God placed Mordecai here to hear of this plot. And what does Mordecai do at the beginning of chapter 4? He goes and tells who? Queen Esther. Oh, you mean the orphan? Yeah, the orphan who is now what? Queen, who has access to who? Oh, and you couldn't write a story this good, could you? No, we couldn't. Well, he learns of the plot. Mordecai, he mourns in public. Verse 3, all the Jews are seeing this. What's going on with Mordecai? Why is he mourning about this? Queen Esther hears that Mordecai is mourning. She wants to know what's going on. Queen Esther is filled in chapter 4, verses 4 through 17. In verses 4 through 9, we see that Esther's concerned for her people. Shouldn't she be? She's just learned that there's this new law that's going out. There's this plot that her and all her people are going to be wiped out. She's concerned for her people, but she's also in verses 10 through 11, she's concerned for herself because Mordecai is like, you need to go before the king. Now, think back to last week, same as Nehemiah. Did you go before the king on your own merits, at your own accord? You had to set up an appointment, correct? And he had to agree for you to enter into his presence. If you just showed up on your own, unannounced, without the agreement, he could do what to you? Have you killed? Would you be concerned about your well-being? Do this. Yes, we all would be. Queen Esther in verses 10 through 11 is concerned about hers. But Mordecai encourages her to trust God. Look at verse 12. And they told Mordecai what Esther had said. Esther is basically saying, I can't just show up in front of the king. And then he goes on to say, then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. Esther, you're not as safe as you think you are. Then verse 14. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise from the Jews from another place. But you who are your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Now that's a popular phrase, isn't it? For such a time as this, isn't it? But I want to submit to you, and this is just my opinion, this is just my interpretation. We are focusing on the wrong phrase. The phrase in verse 14 to focus on is not for such a time as this. There's a phrase before that Mordecai says that we have failed to really focus on. Look at verse 14 again. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will what? Rise for the Jews from where? What is Mordecai saying? Esther, I don't know if God has placed you here for this moment. Maybe He has. We'll find out. But whether it's you or me or someone else, God will raise up His help from where? Somewhere. Why would Mordecai say that? Mordecai knew God could be trusted. That God promised way back when that He was going to keep a remnant. And that if God said there would be a remnant, and if God said there would be a son to sit on the throne of David, there would be a son to sit on the throne of David. And Haman could not eradicate him. Esther, go. Be obedient. Trust God. If He doesn't use you, trust Him. There's some other way. He'll provide it. You ever thought about that? Isn't that wonderful? Nothing will stop God. Nothing will stop His plan. No one. No king, no president, no plotter, no conspirer. No one will stop God. Well, we see in verses 15 through 17, Esther is willing to trust God with her life. And we'll see in chapter 5, she prepares a banquet. She goes before the queen. She prepares a banquet for the king. She invites the king to the banquet, and the king's happy to go. And he's so happy, he's so pleased that he's willing to give her half of his what? Kingdom. And she's just got one request, doesn't she, in chapter 5? Come back to another banquet. You and Haman, right? Sounds pretty good, right? Well, we keep going here. In chapter 5, verses 9 through 14, we see that Haman, yes, he plans to eradicate the Jews, and he's already had the edict go out that was signed and sealed by the king. But what does he want to do to one specific Jew? He wants to hang him. He wants to hang Mordecai on some gallows built at whose house? Haman's house. 50 cubits. I mean, high. Way high up there. Why would he want that? So everybody can what? See it. So he does this. He makes a plan to hang Mordecai. We get back to chapter 6 here, and we see that God causes the king to honor Mordecai. What happens? Chapter 6, verse 1. Look at it. Chapter 6, verse 1. On that night, the king could not sleep. You ever had one of those nights? Yeah. King here had a night. And he gave orders to bring the book of memorable deeds, the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. Now, at the end of chapter 2, what was written in those books? How this guy named Mordecai heard about a plot and told the officials, and the plot was stopped. Well, the king could not sleep. It just happened, right? No. God ordained that king was going to be sleepless that night, and God ordained that king would open the right book and read the right thing about this guy named Mordecai who had saved his life, and then the king's all of a sudden like, well, have we taken care of Mordecai? We haven't given him his Starbucks gift card, have we? Right? We hadn't given him his Longhorn gift card. We hadn't done anything for him. I want to set the royal crown on his head. We need to make plans. And all of a sudden in the story, right, Haman shows up. And the king's like, Haman, for the guy that has saved the king's life, what should we do? And Haman's like, oh man, you need to give him a robe, you need to put him on your horse, and you put the crown on his head. And Haman is thinking the whole time, what? The king wants to honor me. I'm the guy. I'm going to ride the king's horse. I'm going to feel his sweat from his head on his crown. And then the king's like, oh, that's a great idea, Haman. Go get Mordecai. And Haman's like, what? Him? All right. What does he do? Chapter 6. He goes and gets Mordecai. He's forced to honor him. So look at chapter 6, verse 10. Then the king said to Haman, hurry, take the robes and the horse, as you have said, and do so to Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Leave out nothing that you have mentioned. I love that right there. Haman, this whole time, this was a dog and pony show. This was a military event. This was, when the president is inaugurated and they have all that pass and review, think about kind of the same thing. Haman is planning his own pass and review, right? And then he's like, no, it's Mordecai's pass and review now. In verse 11, so Haman took the robes and the horse, and he dressed Mordecai and led him through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. The irony, right? Well, Mordecai returns to the gate. Haman returns to his house. He's very happy, isn't he? No, he's upset. Then we get to chapter 7, don't we? Well, actually, the end of chapter 6, verse 14, Haman is invited to the feast by Queen Esther. Here's the second feast. The king is there. The king is happy again with Queen Esther, and he says, what do you want? I'll give you up to half my kingdom. And what does she say? Verse 4. Well, let me back up to verse 3. Then Queen Esther answered, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be granted me for my wish and my people for my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we have been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent. For our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king. Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther, who is he and where is he? Who has dared to do this? And Esther said, a foe and enemy, the wicked Haman. Then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. In verse 7 it says, and the king arose in his wrath from the wine drinking and went into the palace garden. But Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that harm was determined against him by the king. Of course, we know the king goes out, the king comes back in. Haman is laid out, it says there, on the king's couch, basically pleading for his life. The king says, what, will he even attack the queen in my own presence, my own house? And what happens from there? Well, Haman is drug out. We get into chapter 7, and Haman is what? Hanged where? On the gallows he had made for who? Mordecai. That just happened. Poor fella. It just happened. No, it just happened. God's providential plan being worked out here. He's hanged there. Things are looking up, aren't they? The tide is turned. But the edict to kill the Jews is still in effect. So, what do we see? Queen Esther has to step in once again, doesn't she? Well, that gets us to the third portion of the book of Esther, and we see that God protects Israel from their enemies. Do you see this whole time how I've broken down the structure? The first two chapters, God replaces one queen with his servant, Queen Esther. The second portion, God helps Mordecai and Esther overcome Haman. In this third portion, God does the protecting. That is, he protects Israel from the enemies. Chapter 8 all the way through chapter 10. Esther intercedes for the Jews in chapter 8, verses 1 through 6. She goes back to the king and she tells him about the edict. The king's like, oh, no, let's make this right. And they write a new edict. Who writes that edict, by the way? Mordecai. And the king does what? Stamps it. Sounds good. The edict is basically to this: the Jews are allowed to defend themselves. If they are harmed in any way, they can defend themselves and they can destroy their enemies. That's the beginning of chapter 8. The king writes this. Mordecai helps with this decree. The king signs it. The rest of chapter 8. Then we get to chapter 9, and the Jews defend themselves and they destroy their enemies. It comes where the enemies rise up against them and the Jews destroy them. Look at chapter 9, verse 1. Now in the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, on the 13th day of the same, when the king's command and edict were about to be carried out, on the very day when the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain the mastery over them. I don't know what your translation says, but my translation says the reverse occurred. The opposite happened. The Jews gained mastery over those. The people who hated the Jews, the people who tried to oppress the Jews, would now become the ones who were oppressed and destroyed. God is at work even when it doesn't seem possible, isn't he? Verse 2, it says, they laid hands on them that sought to harm them. I mean, just again, we go all the way down to verse 13. Those gallows that Haman built, that Haman would be hanged from, who else is hanged from them? His 10 sons. You get to verse 15. The Jews who were in Susa gathered also on the 14th day of the month of Adar, and they killed 300 men in Susa. But they laid no hands on the plunder. Why is that important? In 1 Samuel 15, they were commanded to do what with the plunder? Don't touch it. But they did what? Touch. See some obedience here? Are they slow learners? Are we slow learners? I know I am. I'm hard-headed. I've been called that a time or two in my life. Yes. Oh, they don't touch the plunder. Look at verse 16 here. Now, the rest of the Jews who were with the king's provinces also gathered to defend their lives and got relief from their enemies. Now, the way that word is being used, they got. Let me say it another way. They were gifted relief. When I get something, what does that mean? Someone has what? Given me something. Did the Jews produce their own relief? Who gave them relief? God. God gave them relief. Verse 22. As the days on which the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month that had been turned for them. Do you see that? The month that was supposed to be their disaster had been what? turned for them. Who gave them relief? God. Who turned the month for them? God. By the way, I got it in the application. Who's the main character in the book of Esther? It's God. It really is. It's God. I know we read it and we're thinking, oh, there's Esther, and maybe Mordecai is the second best. What about the king, Xerxes? What about Haman? I mean, all those are prominent figures. They're supporting cast. God's the main actor. God's the main character. He's the one making every bit of this happen. Isn't that something? Well, we get to chapter 9, the end of chapter 9, and we see that the Feast of Purim is established to remember the deliverance of the Jews by the hand of God. They do it to this day. And in chapter 10, Mordecai, the one who was supposed to have been hanged, is what? Honored. He's the second in the kingdom now. Isn't that something? We just went through the storyline, the plot line of the book of Esther. There's a lot of application we can draw from this, and I'm just going to draw a few and we'll end tonight. There's so much more we could draw from it. Number one, Esther in chapter 4 had the Jews fast for her. Now, I know we didn't read those verses, but after she had learned what she needed to do to go before the king, she said, look, let the Jews know. Ask them to fast for me. What is she saying when she's asking them to fast? Ask them to do what? We say it with a word that starts with a P. Pray. She was asking the Jews to intercede for her. Pray to God. Have others pray to God for you before you act. Isn't that something? How many times have you acted, then prayed? Anybody in here like that? Anybody in here impulsive? I can be. Brother Van's pointing at Miss Kathy. I think that's a lie, right? I'm going to get him in trouble tonight. So, look, we can be impulsive, correct? Well, was there anything wrong with Queen Esther asking the others to pray? No. Take note of that, right? Man, I got a big decision coming up. Would you pray for me, brother? I got a doctor's appointment coming up. Would you pray for me, sister? I've got this. I've got that. I got to make. I'm at a fork in the road, right? Would you pray for me? Hey, do that. We need to do that, correct? Yeah. So let's keep going. Do you view the things and events in your life as coincidences or inconveniences or obstacles? Or do you view them as God-ordained appointments to accomplish His purposes and plans? Now, I'm going to pick on him here for just a minute, and he can whoop me later. Brother Van, how many years have you known Keith? 7 Fisher. 7 or 8. Do you think that just happened? No. For those that don't know, Keith is the one that received Van's kidney. Where did you meet him at? Building? Probably some kind of, he's an electrician, owns his own company. Probably some kind of, Brother Van probably got himself in a bind with something, and Keith helped him out on some kind of project. No, I'm just joking there. But those things just don't happen, folks. God's what? God's sovereign. He works all those things. Real quick, how in the world would a boy from Richland, Mississippi wind up at Tar Landing Baptist Church? The Marine Corps. Left home at 17. Come to the Marine Corps. I graduated first in one of my classes, and I had the option to go to Hawaii or stay put here in Jacksonville, North Carolina. And this little farm boy looked at the map and said, I can get home easier from here than I can Hawaii. I want to stay here. Got stationed here, met a little lady named Sherry, whose family's from here, whose best friend was Erica Jones, who attended where? Tar Landing Baptist Church, while we were over at Blue Creek, casually attending. We would be invited to Tar Landing Baptist Church. You can blame it on them, okay? We'd be invited in October of 2002 to attend Tar Landing. And it's their fault. Here we are. How did that happen? God, right? The things in our lives, they're not obstacles, they're not inconveniences, they're not coincidences. No, God appoints those things for His purposes and His plan. He is sovereign, and He providentially works out His plans according to His intended ends. That's providence. God working out His plans to accomplish His purposes. Every one of us is, you've got stories just like that. I look back on my life, what used to be so crooked is so straight now. But God. Let me keep going. God's sovereignty over all things is so extraordinary that He uses the most unlikely people in the most unlikely ways to accomplish His purposes and deliver His people. Think about Esther. She's a captive, she's a Jew, and she's an orphan. And God places her where? Mordecai is a Jew, he's a captive, he's hated by another powerful man, and he ends up where? Only God. God uses weak men and women to accomplish His purposes. Hear me, God does not use strong men and women. Strong men and women think they can do it on their own. They don't pray. God uses the Esthers and the Mordecais of the world because they know they need God. Let me keep going. Only got a couple minutes. Mordecai and Esther trusted God. Even when it seemed Esther was waffling in her faith, go back to chapter 4, Mordecai trusted that God would deliver his people in His way. And we saw that in verse 14, didn't we? Mordecai trusted God and encouraged Esther to act. Esther trusted God and went before the king. Neither knew if God would use Esther as an instrument of deliverance, but they were willing to trust God and act to see if that was His way in His time. Both trusted God and submitted their plans to His sovereign care. There are times we have to trust God and submit our plans to His care. All right? Karma. Have you heard the term karma? Karma is not real. It's not a real thing. Consequences for sin is real. Judgment is real. God's grace and mercy are real. When you read the book of Esther, do you think about Romans 8:28? That God is working all things for good for those who love Him or called according to His purpose. Did God work out good in the book of Esther? Yes, He did. When we read the book of Esther, we primarily see the main characters as Esther, Mordecai, Xerxes, and Haman. However, these supporting characters are fulfilling their roles as assigned by the main character, God. God is the one working in the book of Esther. He is the one opening doors and closing doors, moving obstacles, reversing and rearranging failures. In some ways, when we read the book of our life, we think, I am the main character in my life, along with some few family members and friends. We fail to realize it is God who is working. We fail to realize it is God who is our deliverer. We fail to realize that we are the supporting character in our own book of life, in our own story. We fail to realize that our lives are centered around not us, but around the main character, God. God is the main character in your book of life. And in mine, I am not the main character. Did you catch the irony of Haman casting lots back in chapter 3? What is lots? It's like rolling dice. Anybody here ever played dice? I'm not talking about for money, but I'm just talking about a game of fun. You ever cast lots? Somebody drew the short end of the stick, the short straw or something like that. You ever done something like that? Yeah, you're taking a what? Chance. Is there any chances in this book? God's doing what? Do you see the irony? Haman thinks he's taking a chance. God never hopes for an outcome, does he? Haman hoped for an outcome. God acts. God plans always come to fulfillment. God is never dependent on the rolling of dice and the casting of lots. And finally, God delivered his people in some unlikely ways with unlikely people in the book of Esther. Some 2,000 years ago, God sent his unique son, born of a virgin, to deliver his people from their sins. A very unlikely story, right? We would say. That God himself would step out of heaven and take on flesh in his son, Jesus Christ. That the King of heaven would be born in a manger. Well, the book of Esther. I hope it's been helpful to you in some way tonight. God can be trusted, can't he? With everything. If you get nothing else out of this book, please know that the things happening in your life aren't by chance. They aren't by luck. God has ordained them. Let's pray. Father, we thank you that you are a powerful God that ordains all things. We thank you that you can be trusted. We thank you that we can trust you with our lives and our families' lives. Father, I thank you that you are a God who delivers your people. And you are still delivering your people. You are a God of the impossible, doing that which you always make possible. Thank you for being a rescuing God. In Christ's name I pray. Amen. Have a good night, folks.